The Coming of the Rats by George H. Smith. From Atom Magazine, Volume 3, Number 11, 1959. 2 weeks after the big blow-up, I stood outside my cave and watched Old Man Johnson rattle up in his asthmatic Ford truck and climb out with his foxy grandpa face set in a look of determined joviality. He was one of the few survivors I had seen, and I wondered at Providence's mistake in letting him live.
"Got some canned goods I want to sell," he said. "Went into Braxton last night. Ain't nobody alive there, so I figure salvage is salvage."
"Some people might call it looting," I said, checking the cans with my Geiger counter and finding them fairly clean.
"Who you figure to win the war?"
he asked. "I figure whoever's going to win has won already."
"Don't seem like it would be over so soon," he said.
"Doesn't seem to me like there's many people left on either side to fight," I said. "How much you want for these canned goods?"
"Why, I reckon there's more'n 1,000 cans in that there truck. I spent the whole night collecting them in houses and stores and everywhere."
"Yeah, 1,000 cans. How much?"
"Well, now, I figure them cans must be worth $1,000. 1,000 each. That is in times like these, that is."
Johnson spat a huge wad of tobacco right into the face of one of my dogs who had been sniffing about his feet. The dog retreated with a hurt look in his eyes. "You know," I said, trying to keep from laying violent hands on him, "the thing I like about you is that you're such a damn fine human being."
"Ain't no time to be a human no more. Man's got to look after hisself, and hisself alone these days. That's what's wrong with you. You have a cave full of stray dogs and all those other little animals, what you call 'em, ferrets, that you brought up from the city with you. All them eating food you ought to be saving for yourself and your woman. Ain't no time to be human no more. I want $1,000 for them cans."
I almost laughed in his face, but managed to turn it into a frown. "That's a lot of money," I said.
"That's a lot of food. A lot of food these days."
Okay. I handed him the money. Nice and crisp and green, just as when I had gotten them out of the bank when I knew the blow-up was coming. 1,000 pieces of worthless paper. He helped me unload the cans and carry them back into the supply chamber of the cave. Then he set off in his old truck, still grinning, thinking what a big-shot war profiteer he was. I grinned too, over a guy who thought money was worth anything anymore. While I was taking in the rest of the food, I noticed a big rat sitting on a nearby rock, eyeing me. A shiver of unreasoning fear suddenly shot up and down my spine. I had been seeing a lot of rats around here the last week or so, and it bothered me. Barbara Malone came out of the cave. Before the ICBMs hit, she had been my secretary. She was also the best thing I managed to save out of a world gone to hell. Even in the old house dress she wore, her slim, tantalizing curves whispered a delightful invitation. The slimness of that figure was beginning to bother me, though. I had been hoping that by now we would be on the way to repopulating the world. "I'm all out of lipstick," she said ruefully. "I'm sorry, sweets, but I can't imagine where we'll find any more." "Well, I'll just have to get along without it." I put my arms around her and pressed my lips against hers. "I think your mouth tastes even better without it." My caresses grew more ardent. "Please, darling, not right now." She pulled away and walked back to the cave for a moment. I stood watching the gentle sway of her hips, and then I followed her. "Barb, honey, what's the matter?" It's just that, well, what's the use of it? What's the use of sex? If we're right, and we're among the few people left alive, why go on with this nonsense of trying to survive and start over?" I looked at the girl in puzzlement. During the time she had helped me move all the supplies, and as we readied the cave, and during the actual 4 weeks of war, She had been the best of companions. It was only during the last few days that she had become moody and unresponsive to my plans for the future. "What is it? I can't understand what's wrong," I said. "I thought you loved me." "I do love you. I love you very much. But the thought of bringing children into what's left of this world, it's just too much." I suppose I should have expected this sort of thing, but I thought that I knew how to take care of it. In the weeks we had been there, I had learned just how responsive the girl was to my lovemaking. "Can't you see, darling? There isn't any point in our surviving if we don't follow through and try to start things over again." I put my arms around her and pulled her firm, full-breasted body against mine. "It's just, Then my lips were on hers, silencing her protests. My hands were moving over her body, unbuttoning the house dress, fumbling with the catch of her bra. My lips were moving down her neck, over her shoulders and pressing against the suddenly eager swelling of her nipples. She lay there next to me the following morning, with her blonde head on my bare shoulders. "I didn't mean any of the things I said yesterday afternoon," she said. "I know you're right. I know it every time you take me in your arms. It's just when you don't do it often enough, I worry and I feel like there isn't any use." "Then I'll have to see to it that you don't get too much time for that sort of thing," I said, moving my hands over her body again. That afternoon, I saw another rat down by the stream. It was the biggest rat I'd seen in my entire life. A big, grizzled old veteran with a very wise but very evil face. He stood nosing around my footprints, and the sight of him sent chills through my veins. The next morning, I was looking out through the open door of the cave toward a little hill nearby, and a rat was sitting on top of it looking back at me. My blood turned very cold, and I was very glad I'd had the foresight to buy 24 ferrets before leaving the city, and had been befriending every stray dog that came by the cave. For 4 months, we didn't see anyone in our valley except Old Man Johnson. He brought us 2 more loads of food, and put the price up twice. How much longer could this go on? Because the man had begun to develop the signs of radiation poisoning. I didn't say anything to him about it, however, because I wanted every scrap of food I could get. The rats worried me more than the radiation or the threat of starvation, though. That's why I went on adopting every stray dog that came in search of food, and spent so much time tending the 24 little creatures that lived in cages in the supply caves behind our living quarters. "Why do you spend so much time with those filthy things?" Barbara asked. "These aren't filthy things. These are the most important little animals in our world. I knew we would have trouble with rats. That's why I brought them along." "They're filthy. Just look at their cages." I grinned at her. "Whatever happens to the human race, the rats will survive. Rats always survive." "I don't understand." "Ferrets are pound for pound among the most ferocious fighters in the world. They're trained from birth to kill rats." The next day, I found several hundred rats in the pasture when I went to bring sheep and cattle down closer to our cave. The same gray-bearded veteran I had seen before was with them. "They're coming," I told Barbara. I knew they would. They're coming from the sewers and from down under the foundations of the cities where they were safe from the bombs. They've finally eaten everything that was left there. They're moving into the countryside and up into the mountains. Every day we killed more and more rats. In the pasture, down by the stream, and even among the rocks at the very entrance of our cave. For 3 weeks, we worked at digging 3 deep trenches around the mouth of the cave. I diverted water from the stream into the first one. I poured all the gasoline I had into the second one, and in the third one, I placed the cages containing most of the ferrets with the doors open. "What's that moving up there by the big tree?" Barbara asked me one morning. "It looks like the whole pasture is moving." I looked and knew. It was rats. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of them moving across the valley. "Hurry, We've got to drive the sheep and cattle into the supply cave. When we were safely in the cave, after a hectic half hour, I locked the heavy wooden door and piled our furniture in front of the rear cave to form a barricade. I laid out my 2 shotguns with 100 rounds apiece, the hand grenades, and the very pistols I had brought at the same time as the ferrets. I looked out through a loophole in the front of the cave and wished that I could have found a flamethrower for sale. Then we waited. We waited for 3 days, during which not a rat crossed the water ditch. "This is driving me crazy," Barbara complained on the 4th day. "Why do we have to stay cooped up this way? Why can't we go out and drive them away? I'm not afraid of a few rats." "Did you say a few rats? Look out there by the big fir tree on the rise." I handed her my binoculars. She took them and looked where I indicated. "Do you remember the heifer? The one I couldn't drive into the cave with the others?" "Of course, Her voice broke off. "It isn't running now." Barbara screamed as she saw the body of the animal. It was covered with swarming, fighting rats. I pulled her away from the loophole and took up my watch again. She came and sat at my feet. I grinned at her, and she packed up one of the very pistols. I showed her how to load it. Then she looked out the small opening. She stiffened, but didn't flinch at the sight of the uncountable gray bodies that obscured the green of the meadow. "I didn't get enough ferrets. I didn't get enough dogs. I didn't get enough gasoline," I muttered. "Darling." Her fingers dug into my leg. "They've left the cities, because there isn't anything there anymore," I said. The dogs were growling and whining. They had gotten to their feet and were standing stiff-legged around the door. They wanted to get at the rats. "There's someone coming," Barbara said suddenly. "There's a truck coming." I picked up the glasses. There was a truck roaring down the road at desperate speed. A red pickup truck. It was Old Man Johnson, and he didn't make it. His truck plowed through the brown and gray bodies, leaving a stream of red. But it slowed as the bodies piled up in front of it. It kept coming and almost reached the first of my trenches. As it came to a stop, the brown and gray mass poured over it. I could see Johnson trying to open the door, trying to get out. His screams ripped the morning air. My God in heaven," Barbara moaned. I picked up my rifle and fitted in a rifle grenade. It was the only napalm grenade I had, but I had to use it, because it was all that I could do for him. By the time I lined up my sights, the truck was completely covered, and the screams were muffled. I pulled the trigger and looked away as a burst of flames wiped out the pile of moving life. Barbara's fingers dug deeply into my arm. The dogs groaned, and the ferrets hurled themselves against the wire of their cages. The brown and gray mass came over the first trench with hardly a pause. The water had been a mistake. Somehow I had thought that they couldn't swim. Not against the flowing water of the stream, anyway. They came with water dripping from their furry bodies, and their teeth gleaming. I waited as sweat poured from my forehead. I waited until they were piled by the thousands into the second pit, and were beginning to crawl up the side of the other by the dozens. Do something! Do something!" Barbara whispered. I pressed the button that lit the spark that set off the gasoline in the second trench. As the all-consuming flame leaped upward and flared all too briefly against the sky, I knew real terror. I should have bought more gasoline. I should have bought more gasoline from here to Sunday. I should have buried barrels of it where I could have pumped it into the ditch to keep the fire going for hours instead of minutes. But it was too late now. The fire was already going out. The third ditch gave them more trouble. For almost an hour, hundreds of rats poured down into it, and none of them came out. I couldn't see what was going on, but I knew it must be a battle of epic proportions, in which all but 6 of our ferrets were fighting their last battle against tremendous odds. Finally, a big red-eyed demon crawled out of one side of the trench, only to be pulled back down. Then another, with half his body gone, crawled out to die. while another followed him, dripping blood, and darted towards the door of the cave. 2 more came, and I blasted them with a single shotgun shell. But more and more were coming now. Dozens became hundreds. They knew there was food inside the cave, and they were starving. We fired 200 rounds of shotgun ammunition, and I threw 24 grenades. Rats piled up on our little strip of sand 2 feet deep, but still they came. They charged against the door and began gnawing at it. I blasted them with a flare from a very pistol, but they came back time after time. "How long will it hold?" Barbara asked, hearing the teeth chewing at the door. "I don't know," I said. I had one hand in the stiff hair of Dolly, one of my favorite dogs. Jake, a big terrier, was quivering against my legs. In a shorter time than I expected, a hole appeared at the bottom of the door, and a pair of fiery eyes peered through. The terrier tore off the head as it came through, but another followed it. "Turn those ferrets loose," I told Barbara. "We've killed so many you'd think—" "How many do you think there are?" "How do we know how fast they're breeding? How do we know what effect the bomb radiation had on them?" I was looking at the hole as I talked, and there on the hill I saw him again. He must have been at least 2 feet long, a veritable old patriarch of his people, a Moses, leading them to some promised land. He stood there with his lieutenants, grouped around him watching the advance on our fortress. They kept on coming. The door was chewed into something resembling lace, their claws and their teeth ripping and tearing it to pieces. Dozens of them were squeezing through now. Time after time the dogs were striking, and every time they struck they made a kill. The ferrets followed them in, and got to any that got past them. But the rats kept coming. We couldn't get at the loopholes anymore. The last time I tried, I pulled my hand back with a wriggling rat hanging onto it by his long, sharp teeth. His teeth stayed locked in my hand even after I had battered him to death against the wall of the cave. I had to pry his jaws open to free myself. Suddenly, the door collapsed completely, and in they came, by the hundreds. I saw one dog dragged down, then another, but the rest went on fighting. Twice they almost cleared the cave of rats, but each time it filled up again. We had backed up behind the barricade, and I was helping the dogs and the ferrets as much as I could with my .45, although shooting rats with a .45 is an almost hopeless feat. The dogs were being driven back. They were being beaten by the sharp teeth and claws of hundreds of times their number of rats. The dogs were quitting. 4 of them lay dead, and the others were slinking back behind the barricade with us, blood dripping from scores of bites and scratches on their bodies. The ferrets were still fighting. They would fight until they died. "Barbara, the pistols!" I yelled, grabbing the last 2 as she handed them to me. I pulled the triggers and sent twin bursts of fire across the cave. Christ, single shots. If someone had only invented repeating flare guns, I thought, as the flares burst and drove them back, incinerating the rats and giving the last ferrets a respite. As fast as Barbara could load the big chambers of the flare pistols, I emptied them. It wasn't enough. I filled the other side of the cave with flames, but it wasn't enough. They still came on, their little red eyes gleaming with hate and bloodlust. Then we ran out of flares. I was down to my .45 and my machete now. We backed further into the supply cave, back to where the dogs had fled, calling to them, trying to get them to fight. I was kicking at the rats now, trying to beat them off my legs, chopping at them with the machete. One was hanging onto my arm, teeth embedded in my muscle. Barbara squirmed in behind me, screaming. I turned and grabbed the tail of a filthy beast whose teeth were sunk into her breast. She was struggling with another one on her shoulder. We were being smothered with vicious, furry bodies. Smothered with gleaming white teeth that were turning red with our blood. It was then that I saw him. I had killed hundreds of them by shooting at the mass of them with the .45, and letting the big slugs batter their way through, but I hadn't hit a single one with sharpshooting. But there was the general, the prophet, come to take part in the final victory. I shook off one whose teeth were in my wrist and lifted the gun. My shot sent a slug smashing at him. He moved fast. I could almost see the startled expression on his face as he leaped. He moved fast, but not fast enough. The slug caught him and blew him to pieces. There was a notable pause in their attack. It was almost as though the rats lost heart with the death of their leader. The dogs returned to the fight now. Dolly tore one of the things off my back, and Jake and a small black spaniel joined her. A ferret took up a spot between my legs, and slowly we began to turn the tide. Afterwards, hours afterwards, when we had killed the last one in the cave and somehow barricaded the door, I fell, exhausted, to the floor. Barbara came and put her arms around me, and I kissed her, thinking that we might be the last people on Earth, thinking that the rats would be back someday, thinking, what's the use? Then I looked at Barbara, and somehow I knew that she had changed her mind. We weren't going to be the only people left on Earth. We might be alone now, but we would have children. When the rats came back, we would be ready for them. I'll breed dogs and ferrets, I told her. I'll get more gasoline, and we'll put up an iron door this time. We'll stop them for as long as we have to. Barbara kissed me through her tears, and I knew that I was right.